Okay, well, I have the top of the hour here, so I want to say hello and welcome to today's webinar on It Takes a Village. This webinar is part of a webinar series that works to help prepare Oregonians for wildfire season. My name is Carrie Berger, and along with being your host today, I'm the manager of Oregon State University's Extension Fire Program. Some of you may already know, but for others that don't, the FIRE program is a fairly new program in extension, and part of our mission is to provide fire education and outreach to all Oregonians. And much like our forestry and natural resource extension colleagues, the FIRE team live and work in communities throughout Oregon. I've actually got the entire FIRE program team on the line with me today. And we have one extension state fire specialist and 6 regional fire specialists, again, located throughout Oregon. Hey, y'all, thanks for being on the line with us today. You can find a fire specialist in your local area by going to our people page. And John Rizza, who is our Northeast fire specialist and the moderator for today's webinar, will post that people page link in the chat box now. So, the 2020 wildfires affected most Oregonians, and some of you had to evacuate your homes. Some of you had to deal with weeks of unhealthy air quality due to the wildfire smoke, and some of you lost everything. I know I speak for all of us in the fire program and in extension that we are truly sorry for the impact wildfire has had on your lives. We acknowledge that, recovery is ongoing and is likely a stressful time with challenges that are affecting some of you in deeper ways than others. It is not our intention to undermine those challenges or the severity of your losses, but to acknowledge with respect and as much understanding as possible. To the over 700 registrants who signed up for today's webinar, for those of you watching live on Facebook, and for those of you who watch the recording of this webinar, thank you. Thank you for engaging in fire awareness and preparedness work. This work is important for everyone living in Oregon. The FireWare Fire Prepared webinar series was developed to help Oregonians prepare for the reality of wildfire. If you are listening in from another state, welcome. The information provided in this series will be applicable to you as well. We have 7 webinars scheduled this spring, starting with today's webinar that helps to kick off the series. Then on March 31st, we will review practical steps you and your neighbors can do on your properties before fire season. Then we'll talk about building community for better preparedness, a ready, set, go plan. We'll talk about fire on the landscape and what to do or expect when a fire hits and recovery after a fire. The webinar series aims to address preparedness at 3 levels: individual, community, and the landscape. What you can do now to get yourself, your family, your home ready, how you can be part of promoting a wildfire-safe community, and how you can live and thrive in a fire-adapted environment. It is our intention to provide broad level information in these 7 webinars and then provide local online meetings that will dial this information in for your area or county. And because you're signed up for this webinar, you will receive information for those area-specific meetings. So stay tuned and feel free to visit the online webinar guide for updates. Now, I want to call attention to the fact that extension is just one entity, and we simply cannot do this work alone. It really does take a village. There are many partners we work with, but in particular, I'd like to thank the Oregon Department of Forestry, Keep Oregon Green, the Office of the State Fire Marshal, and the Office of Emergency Management for supporting and partnering with us to provide you this webinar series. I also want to thank you because it is the important work that you'll do that will really make the difference. Okay, so before we begin our presentations and discussions, I have some webinar logistics that I'd like to quickly cover. This session is being recorded, and all webinar recordings can be found on our Forestry and Natural Resource Extension YouTube channel. We are also streaming live on the Extension Facebook page. For the people tuning into this webinar on Zoom, your audio has been muted. If you are having audio troubles and are connected to your computer's audio, I suggest hanging up and dialing in with your phone. You can always post a question in the chat window if you are having difficulties. John Rizza will be monitoring the chat window and can help you out. Thanks again for that, John. If you have a question on the information that is being presented, please type your question in the Q&A window. We plan to pause at about 12:40 or so for a question and answer session. If you don't catch all the information presented, please don't worry. I'll provide all the resources and links mentioned during this webinar on our fire program website. And I'll even follow up with an email just to be sure you get the information. Okay, so let's get this webinar started. We are going to start by talking about what's the fire problem. Then we'll talk about risk. We'll also talk about community and community action and let you know resources to get you started and connected to your local groups. Again, at about 12:40, we'll open it up for question and answer session, but feel free to put your questions in that Q&A window at any point in the presentation. Before I turn it over, let it be acknowledged that Oregon State University in Corvallis, Oregon, is located within the traditional homelands of the Marys River, or Ampinifu Band of Kalapuya. Following the Willamette Valley Treaty of 1855, Kalapuya people were forcibly removed to reservations in Western Oregon. Today, living descendants of these people are part of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians. All OSU Extension education happens on Indigenous homelands. We are working with OSU and our tribal liaisons to better understand and build meaningful relationship with tribal communities. Okay, Amanda Rao, who is the fire specialist for the Willamette Valley and North Cascades, will now start us off. Amanda, whenever you're ready.
Is fire the problem? I pose that question because I just want you guys to think about that. Are there good fires? Are there bad fires? And maybe we can continue that conversation throughout this presentation and as well as future webinars. I use this slide because I just wanted to illustrate that we had a lot of success during an active fire suppression era, and now we're entering this warmer, drier climate period of increased fire. But it's not unprecedented, and in fact, as Daniel's already said, we've had fires that were much larger than our most recent ones, and Beachy Creek tops out at 12. So this isn't unprecedented, but it's a good signal that we may be in for more of this moving forward because we're coming into this warmer, drier period. Looking at the fire behavior triangle, which is something that we use to help us understand what are the inputs to fire behavior and how is it influenced by the weather and topography and fuels. Well, of those three arms of that triangle, weather and fuels are the parts that have the most change, over time. Topography doesn't change very much for the most part, and weather is influenced by climate change. And so we know that when we have wet, stormy winters, that produces higher fine fuel loading. There's also increased dead fuel loading from storms that bring things from the canopy down to the surface and onto the ground level where fire propagates and initiates. The hotter and drier summers associated with climate change also result in more lightning, higher wind speeds, earlier snowmelt, hotter fires, and drier fuels overall. And so we know that This is really contributing to what we call wildfire risk, and that's what Daniel's really here to speak more about, even though he was gracious enough to take over for me here with my challenges. But what we're seeing is that the average annual temperature in the U.S. has increased by about 2 degrees Fahrenheit or more since 1970. Our snowpacks are 4 weeks earlier than they were in previous decades. And the conditions in the forest are primed for wildfires to ignite and spread during a greater part of the year. During the 1970s, the fire season was about 4 months long, and now it's closer to 7 or longer. And so our fire season is increasing, and that means that both the spatial and temporal context are expanding for more fire on the landscape. And that is going to lead into Daniel's explanation about risk. And I think he may have been introduced already, but because I was a little distracted, I'm not sure he was. So just to be clear, Daniel Lavelle is our statewide fire specialist, and I'm going to turn it over to him now. So.
Okay, well, thank you, Amanda. I appreciate that. And I want to share the screen. And can you see that slide?
I sure can, Daniel.
Okay, great. So I want to begin by discussing, let's talk about risk. Fire is not a risk. Fire is a hazard. Now, what do I mean by that? What the heck? Well, a hazard is something that can cause harm. Electricity, chemicals, ladder, noise, vehicle, chainsaw, stress, and fire. That said, a hazard is also something that can be beneficial. Electricity, chemicals, ladder, noise, a vehicle, chainsaw, stress, and fire. When I was much younger, I was taught repeatedly that a little bit of pain, a little bit of stress can make you stronger. A lot of pain, a lot of stress can kill you. So that's just a little aside for that. A risk is the chance, the probability, normally expressed as high, moderate, or low, that any hazard can or will harm a value that is at risk, and to what degree of harm, normally expressed as high, moderate, or low. This way, this is a risk assessment, a generic risk assessment. Again, likelihood on the left, that a hazard will cause a consequence or a degree of harm on the right. And that's normally expressed from high to low, extreme to low. And what do I mean by that? Well, here's a real life example of that, where if you took a fire hazard, what you do is identify that fire hazard, and we normally identify that by modeling it. What is the capability of that fire through flame length, rate of spread, burn probability, and if we added drought and we added insect and disease, flammable plants, we put all that together as an integrated hazard. We measured it, identified it, measured it, we understand it. Well, on the other side of the equation are the values at risk. That could be infrastructure, it could be structures, it could be people, it could be pets, it could be whatever within a community. Well, we identify those values and we identify how vulnerable those values are to that hazard. That is measured by this chart, and that's your relative risk. An example is ladder. If you use a broken down ladder, and I have two, and if you use it in a kind of a foolish manner, which I have too, that risk, the probability of causing the value a consequence of harm goes up. Each year, more than 500,000 people are injured from ladders. 164,000 of those go to the emergency room, and there are 300 deaths caused by the bad use of a ladder or a ladder not being in good shape. But if you follow a safe stepladder use and you make sure your tool, your hazard is in good shape, and you follow the instructions in the safety manual, the probability of harm goes down and the degree of harm goes down. Chainsaw example. If I've used a chainsaw most of my life, if you use a chainsaw that hasn't been maintained, dull bar, in bad shape, use it wrong, kickback, the probability of causing harm goes dramatically up. I can choose to use a chainsaw in shorts and sandals. If I foolishly do that, the probability of that hazard causing me a high degree of harm goes dramatically upward. The more PPE I use, chaps and shield and the hard hat and gloves and good solid pants and boots, the probability goes down. Not to say it won't happen, but it goes down. If I follow the owner's manual, that's what it's intended to do. Reduce the probability, reduce the harm, lessen the risk. That's what it's all about. How do we apply that to fire? Same. Fire is a hazard. Fire can be beneficial. It can give us heat. It can save our lives. It can give us a campfire, cook our food, give us pleasure. It can, we can do prescribed burning as long as we follow the rules and keep it within bounds. Fire can be a very beneficial tool. But if we use fire in a red flag warning, when the wind temperature and humidity have converged to be a red flag warning on hot summer days, and we don't take precautions to mitigate risk around our house, which I hope we'll get through later, leaves in the gutter, wood shake roofs, and vegetation all over. If we don't do that, then the probability of that hazard causing us harm goes up, and the degree of harm goes up. You can measure all of that. I've always wanted to come up with a user manual for fire. I haven't, but what these good folks are going to be talking about throughout this webinar and webinar series are essentially how to use fire to minimize the risk by lessening the probability of fire as a hazard causing a high degree of harm. That's what they're going to do. And we have innumerable tools to do exactly that, to lessen the risk, reduce the probability of a severe harm happening. Innumerable things to do within the house, around the house, on the landscape. And this webinar series will go over some more details on that, but they're all meant to reduce the probability of fire as a hazard causing a degree of harm, a high degree of harm. You want to keep it down in here. You don't want it to go up in here. To summarize, to assess risk, you need to identify, assess, and model the hazards. Now, I can apply this to almost any hazard. You need to watch out for compounding multiplicative factors. Drought. For fire, it's drought. It's flammable shrub. It's all of that. It's wood shake. It's exposure time. It's all of that. You need to identify the values at risk to those hazards, whether it's us, whether it's your home, whether it's your yard, whether it's your landscape, whether it's your community, whether it's anything that you value at risk to fire, which honestly is almost everything. You need to assess how vulnerable those values are to the exposure of fire and to the degree of response and vulnerability of that value to the hazard of fire. You need to assess that. Then you need to calculate the level of relative risk that results. Then you need to make some decisions. And I feel our decisions are our responsibility, individually, collectively, community, all. It's our responsibility to make those decisions based on acceptable risk. Do I mitigate? Do I do the defensible space? Do I charge my fire extinguishers? And do I check my on and on and on and on and on? Those are personal decisions, personal responsibilities. Because if you choose not to, you essentially make a decision on how much risk you're willing to accept. If you choose to stay in the red once you've assessed, it's your choice, but the consequences could be great. And I know you can't always make that choice. The choice is made for you. I know that. But you should be able to mitigate, reduce the unacceptable risk, go from red to green as best as you can. Manage the hazards, protect the values at risk, bottom line, reduce the likelihood, reduce the consequence of harm. So the question is, and Carrie will go over this, what motivates you to reduce your risk? Carrie?
Great, thank you, Daniel. And hopefully by now you have a little bit better understanding of the fire problem and risk. So like Daniel said, we're interested to hear what motivates you to reduce your risk. So let us know. We're going to do some interaction here by going to the website www.menti, that's MENTI.com, and type in the code 27935685, and John will be putting that in the chat box. Or you can scan the QR code using your smartphone's camera app, and the website should just pop up for you. So go ahead and type 1 to 3 things that motivate you to reduce your risk. And then I'm going to share a fun little word cloud here. So go ahead and submit some of those answers. And Daniel, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing your screen so that I may share my screen. Here we go. So you guys should be seeing now on my screen what motivates you to reduce your risk. You can go to this website, menti.com, and use that code, put in that code. Unfortunately, I took the QR code away, but enter your responses and we should be seeing a word cloud start to generate. So go ahead and do that. Let's take a moment to do that. I'm just going to refresh this page to make sure that it's coming up. And let me just make sure that it's working. Oh, there we go. Look at that, you guys. Hopefully you're all seeing that word cloud develop. What motivates you to reduce your risk? Fear, safety, absolutely. Your family, home. I'm actually getting a little bit of shivers here. I love these things. Fear, safety, family keep coming up. So the bigger the word, the more that you all have put in that same word. So a lot of people have put in fear, a lot of people have put in safety, and a lot of people have put in family. So that's just wonderful. Thank you for sharing, and just know that your words aren't linked to you in any way. So if you were hesitant to share, go ahead and share. There's no way that I can see who submitted what word. It's just a fun little exercise here. Again, we have about 430 people on the line, and I think this says a lot right here. So I'm going to transition us to just keep on schedule here and turn it over to Ariel Cowan. Ariel is our regional fire specialist for Central Oregon, and she's going to talk to you about community. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing, but I will share a photo of this in a follow-up email so you all can see it, all right? So let me just stop sharing here. And it's all yours, Ari.
Thank you, Carrie. Hi, everyone. Great to see you all on this sunny afternoon. And I thought that was really fascinating to go through that Menti exercise and take a look at that word cloud, seeing that safety, home and family and property were some of the common words that came up. And I can really relate to that. And we're going to be talking a lot about that in our upcoming webinars. So then what is our collective journey moving forward? So with finding a lot of commonality in what motivates us, what we value that we want to protect, and what we want to improve our collective well-being into the future, we can share these goals, but why not take this journey together? We can improve individual awareness and preparedness, but at the same time, we can improve our community awareness and preparedness. So as they say, many hands make light work. Just to clarify, when I say community, it can mean your urban or suburban neighborhood, your town, your hobby group, your friends, or the rural landowners that live around you. Those are just some examples. Next, I'm going to play a short video from our neighbors to the north, the Washington Fire Adapted Communities Program. They created a video that outlines many of the topics we'll be covering in the coming weeks. And just a heads up, this is a 2-minute video.
Damien, Lupe, and Mary are all working to make their community better able to live with wildfire, because they know fire is natural where they have chosen to live. They understand their risk and are actively working to reduce that risk. Fred, Damien, Lupe, and Mary live in a fire-adapted community, even if they don't realize it. As we have seen from Fred and his neighbors, there are many tools and strategies for communities adapting to wildland fire. Not every community will use every tool, but generally speaking, the more actions a community takes, the more ready for fire it will become. As we have seen, Fred and his neighbors are taking action before a wildfire. But it is important to realize that community preparedness before a fire, safe and efficient wildfire response during a fire, and a well-resourced and supported recovery after a fire are all part of the process. What does success look like? Just like in Fred's neighborhood, success looks like many people working together to prepare for the effects of wildfire. In that way, the responsibilities and benefits of adapting to wildfire are shared among all those who live in places where fires burn. Here are 5 easy ways you can help your community become more fire adapted. 1. Make sure your home is prepared for wildfire by using fire-resistant construction materials and keeping vegetation from touching the structure. 2. Talk to your neighbors about wildfire and encourage them to take action too. 3. Prepare your family for an evacuation by making an emergency kit and having an evacuation plan. 4. Find out if your community has a community wildfire protection plan. Volunteer to work with your local fire response organizations to create or update it.
Great, so I thought that was a great little video for us to see. Go back into the PowerPoint. So I really like how that video not only outlines the important topics that we will cover in this webinar, but also emphasizes the importance of doing this work collectively. I want to bring up another reason for doing this work together, because many fires spread from embers traveling from one area to the next. It's important to think of fire preparedness as not just an individual issue, but a community level issue to tackle. I get it, this can feel discouraging when you are unsure if those around you are willing to put in the work let alone are aware of the risks. I saw how somebody had mentioned in the chat that they're concerned that their neighbors might not be aware of these risks or not willing to put in the work. But I want us to not only think about fire embers, but also think about communication embers. You can be the spark to get your community into awareness and action. And there's a real power to being able to doing the work yourself and others around you being inspired by that. So we can inspire and encourage those around us, but sometimes we need help too. Say you want to work on your property, but you don't have the equipment. What if you feel like you don't have the funds or the time? Even if you did the work in your own backyard, you're not likely to do the work for your entire neighborhood. So I want to introduce you to a very important concept that I learned from the Coalitions and Collaboratives, Inc. that you can use to make a difference. Asset-based community development. Let's break that down. Assets are something of value that we already have that adds quality to life. For example, there are people in your community that have local knowledge and skills. Community development is a process where people come together to take action on what's important to them. So asset-based community development is that same process, building off of the great resources you already have within your community. Here's an example of a community asset map. Don't worry about the small text. It's the part you would fill in for your community. You'll identify the assets from each of the categories, from individuals to associations to local knowledge and culture. For example, individual assets can be people you know with skills in leadership, writing, accounting, event planning, education, carpentry, or forestry. These are just some examples. And there are also physical assets like buildings, land, water, grazing animals, and community gathering spaces. Asset-based community development can help with looking at your community from a glass half full perspective. How great it is to have all these assets in your community. Community-led means it will be an effort from within the community to work together towards shared goals and visions. In the case of fire, it can be a shared goal of learning how to make go bags, design an evacuation plan, or create defensible space, which are all topics we will be covering. This way, any assistance from outside organizations is accepted on your community's terms. By reminding communities of their strength, strong minds and hearts will be able to increase fire awareness, fire preparedness, and reduce your community's risk. So how does this work? First, I encourage you to talk to your community members about organizing. Find out who shares the same goals and who is willing to at least start a committee. It helps to identify who in the community has time to start the effort, giving those with less availability the opportunity to join once a plan has been made. Once you have a committee, meet to identify the common goals and all the assets you have access to. Let's say one of the goals identified by the committee is to create more defensible space around homes, and you decide to organize an annual collective workday. Maybe someone has equipment they can lend or knows techniques to show others. Maybe there is a youth group that can get involved. Maybe someone will enjoy planning or hosting the barbecue that follows. Someone might be good at fundraising with a bake sale. We all have things that we are good at, and we can share in that wealth of skill. Next, utilize your committee to make a plan. This plan would outline your short and long-term goals. Who is doing what the needs are to get goals accomplished. You can revisit and update this plan every year or few years, but it'll be good to have something that can be passed on whether or not committee members move away. Recognize that this may take time, but will be worth the effort. The last point is to find a way to share information with the rest of the community. For example, say your community decides that one great way to increase awareness and highlight the defensible space workday you just planned is with the development of a newsletter. You can identify who in your community has writing skills to make this newsletter, who is a good communicator or connector to be the point of contact with the local fire department, or who has computer or graphic design skills. Nope. there we go. Using asset-based community development with a focus on fire can be one of the first steps to help you build a fire-adapted community, like from the video we watched. The methods I just described is a very similar model to a program that many of you may have heard of. FireWise USA program is a national program that assists communities in developing into fire-adapted, or otherwise known as FireWise communities. Broadening education opportunities and empowering communities to protect themselves will foster a culture of fire preparedness. I want to recognize that we are all at different stages in our awareness and preparedness journey. Maybe you're just starting out, or maybe you already live in a FireWise neighborhood but want to learn more. The next few webinars in this series will discuss this program and other options in greater detail. So you may be asking, where do I find more information, or who can help my community become fire adapted? Well, it's good to know who your resources are. John will post a link in the chat to a resource guide. You can contact your local Oregon Department of Forestry, or ODF, stewardship forester to ask how to get started with a FireWise community program. Your county might already have a fire adapted communities coordinator who can help with this. You can also reach out to your local OSU Extension forester for advice on forests and natural resources, or contact your local Extension fire specialist for fire-related questions and support. ODF and your local fire department are great resources for fire and land management questions, and they can arrange for a property or neighborhood fire hazard assessment. Organizations like the Natural Resource Conservation Service, the USDA Farm Service Agency, ODF, the Oregon State Fire Marshal, your county, local watershed council, or Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board might have assistance funding to help offset some of the costs of fire hazard reduction projects. These are just a few of the resources available that have information to share. I just want to remind you that firefighting and emergency agencies want to protect our properties and help us evacuate, but we must recognize there are times when multiple fires are occurring and personnel or equipment are limited, unavailable, or delayed. The hard truth is that there are times when fire behavior is too extreme for anyone to engage. If the skies are completely smoky, these agencies will not easily be able to size up a fire or attack from the air. This is why we need to rely on ourselves and each other to be prepared. Work on preparedness is a year-round effort, and it can start now. With all that firefighters do to help us, let's thank them and help them by making their jobs safer and more manageable. And I'd like to thank everyone listening for joining us in this effort.